Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 29, chapter 29, entitled By the Pricking of My Thumbs. Hey Midori, you doing alright? Stress of the sports festival getting to you? Midori's head popped off of the cushion that was his arms, and he snappily sat upright at his desk. Had class started yet? No, Izuku was still napping away in the corner of the room, while everyone waited for Present Mike to arrive for English. He rubbed tiredly at his eyes, trying to knead the exhaustion from his body. He hadn't been able to get much of any sleep the past few days. Any rest he was lucky enough to have snagged was brutally interrupted. It was worse than his first couple of months as death, when his elementary self was trying to just get used to the harsh schedule necessary for the job. He groaned out an unintentional yawn, feeling his little strength leave him as quickly as his breath. He rubbed at his face a bit more aggressively, hoping the rough fabric of his new gloves would wake him up. Kirishima is here. Did you forget? Gami's voice came like a sharp jab to the head, making him fully aware of the chatter echoing along the classroom walls, what he wouldn't give for silence right about now, that feeling of being underwater, the world drowned out by a barrier of sloshing sea. Every small sound was much too painful of a stimulus for his sensitive brain, and he was torn between wanting to scream at everyone to shut up and not wanting to add to the cacophony of sounds. Midori? Wait, Kirishima. He raised his head just barely, but it was enough to see his red-headed classmate standing over him, right next to his desk. He was awake now. Hey, I'm good. Nailed it. Gami would have laughed if he wasn't so concerned about his successor's health over the past few days. Kirishima sent a toothy, awkward smile. You sure? You sure don't sound like it. Leave it to Kirishima to start poking his nose where it didn't belong. Of course, he knew it was only out of concern, but his worry was starting to attract the attention of his other classmates, and that was really less than ideal right now. I'm fine, really, he insisted, waving off both his peer and his worries. Just haven't been sleeping that well as of late. Haven't been sleeping well, huh? He wished it was that simple, but, of course, since the universe really enjoyed seeing him squirm, his comment was just enough to catch Ida's attention. He couldn't stop the groan of annoyance from escaping him as he watched the class president stand up stiffly and stride over to his desk as well. He collapsed his head back into the solitude of his arms, hoping that if he could just not see them, maybe they'd go away. At this point, it was a miracle that the entire class hadn't noticed what was happening in the back yet. Midoriya, Ida began, his tone sharp and punctual, just enough to really sting in Midoriya's eardrums. You should know how important sleep is to a growing body. How can you expect to perform at your best when you're not providing yourself with the basic necessities of function? While Ida was right, it really wasn't that simple. He wanted so badly to sleep, to collapse and rest away an entire day, but it seems like every time he closed his eyes, a gruesome reenactment of the bloodied visions that he'd been subject to was waiting there for him. A couple more had come to him at night, in the form of gut-wrenching nightmares that left him panicked and heaving for air, but that wasn't even the worst part. The sheer density of just how many violent premonitions he'd had in the past week or so was cruel. It shouldn't have even been possible. Every second his eyes closed, it was like all he could see was blood and death. They were up to 13 now. Are you stressed about the sports festival? Kirishima piped up, repeating his initial assumption from earlier. 'Cause I know you'll do great. You're one of the manliest people in class. Manly? He wasn't sure he'd consider himself that. Nothing about him really gave off the vibe of a strong or dependable person that Kirishima seemed to look up to. After all, the past 13 heroes he'd witnessed murdered couldn't depend on him for their rescue. He'd failed them, each and every one of them. All he could do was hide in his room and cry, desperately praying that Tsukuuchi or some top-ranking hero would catch the hero killer before he got the chance to strike again. Here, Ida slammed a piece of notebook paper onto his desk right beside the fallen head from who knows where. I have listed for you a series of tactics to employ right before heading to sleep, consisting of but not limited to reevaluating your sleep schedule, drinking herbal teas, taking nightly doses of melatonin supplements. It was at that moment that the classroom door slammed open, and while the sudden noise was unwelcome, it was definitely an upgrade of whatever his rule-abiding friend was going on about. It was more for Ida's sake that he was interrupted, seeing as Midori was so close to snapping just to have the partial silence return. And then he remembered that this was English, and Present Mike taught it. This was going to be a pretty long morning. Both his classmates had scurried back off to their seats, and the rest of the room hushed into a silence. Sweet, beautiful silence. He almost cried. The absence of noise was that wonderful. The pounding in his skull suddenly died off, retreating back to the edges of his mindscape. Maybe now he could finally focus his willpower on curing the sickness in his stomach, of which he didn't think stemmed from exhaustion, nor his repulsion toward his visions, nor a lack of food this morning. "You took your sweet time today," Aizawa remarked as he stood up and slipped his rolled-up sleeping bag under his arm. "Whatever, just try to keep it down today." The boy moaned again, burying his head further into his arms. While his teacher's nonchalant voice wasn't particularly loud, it still rang around in his head. Moving his focus to there instead of the nausea in his gut, he felt so wasted today, and Aizawa obviously could tell, but maybe if Present Mike wasn't as loud as he usually was, just maybe, he could collect his mush of thoughts. Maybe he could work on willing away the churning in his stomach. It was a terrible sickness, not caused by any of the issues currently plaguing him, though maybe he could attribute part of the sadism of the hero killer to it. But that was besides the point. It was a terrible sickness, all at the result of... "Keep it down! Come on, Eraserhead! You should know that that isn't part of my style." Midoriya clawed at his head, his ears, his neck, just anywhere in hopes that it would stop the piercing migraine in his temples and the raging twister in his gut. He nearly cried out, but all his energy was gone, replaced with an overwhelming sense of agony that he just couldn't shake. He didn't get to see his homeroom teacher leave, but his exiting footsteps were more than enough to cue him of what was to come. The classroom door clicked shut gently, but that was probably going to be the last quiet sound for a good long while. Scratch long morning, it was going to be a pretty long day. Gami's skeletal fingers ran through his hair, and the tips of his bone felt soothing against the scalp. He leaned into it slightly, too tired to think about what he was doing. Present Mike was talking about something, but it all sounded like painful dissonance. He hoped that he wasn't missing anything important. Maybe if he was given enough time, he could conjure enough strength to lift his head out of his hands and actually focus. "Come on, Izu," Gami coaxed just as quietly as he could. "I know this morning's been particularly rough on you, but you have to focus." The teen released a muffled moan into his arms, before at least lifting his head into his hands to avoid being caught slacking off. His eyes fluttered at the sudden brightness of everything around him, compared to the comforting darkness of his arms. Already it felt like too much work, trying to stay focused when it was too bright, too loud, and he was too sick. "You just have to make it to lunch. That might assist you in curing your nervous queasiness as well." Maybe. Maybe not. To be honest, he wasn't all that sure that more food would help his rocky sea of a stomach acid. He just needed to get through the school day, and then get through the end of the day. Surely the meeting couldn't be that bad, and yet here he was, sick to his stomach at the mere prospect of it. He had wanted this. How could he have known that he was actually going to get it, though? He'd be also submitting himself to more anguish. His gut twisted again, like a towel, and he nearly fell, face first into his desk. Thankfully, the groan was caught in his throat and didn't make it to the ambient noise of the classroom. Gami grew more concerned over the worsening of Midoriya's condition. Maybe a trip to the restroom is not such a bad idea. That sounded potentially helpful, the chance to be alone for a moment of blissful silence, even just to collect his scrambled thoughts. The more he thought about the prospect of moving, of getting out of his chair, the worse he seemed to feel. God, he was a mess, and the longer he felt less than ideal, the more angry he began to grow towards himself. Was he really this weak? Did this really have such a strong effect on him? Even after so many months? Come on, he was death. Well, one of many, but regardless, he had dealt with so much more, so much worse. Surely he was above this? Surely he would outlive his issues with time? That didn't really help. In fact, it only made him realize he was going to be stuck with his demons far longer than anyone else had to be. Maybe a trip to the bathroom wasn't such a bad idea. Maybe he just needed to puke it all out, get it out of his system. Maybe all he needed was a good, fresh start to the day, or at least a good, fresh start to his stomach. Yeah, that sounded like the best course of action right now. Either way, it sure beat shriveling up on his desk any day. So Midoriya raised his hand slightly, one of those pathetic waves with his elbow still resting on the tabletop. He leaned his head on his wrist, balancing himself like a dangerous game of Jenga. Hopefully this was enough to catch Present Mike's attention without alerting everyone else. He really didn't need Ida or Kirishima or, quite frankly, anyone on his back again. He would have appreciated the sincerity of the sentiment, but he just wanted to get up and go. "Ah, wonderful, Midoriya! I knew I could count on you," Present Mike cheered at seeing the raised hand. "So what's your answer, little listener?" The teen blinked like a deer caught in the headlights. Wait, what? The preposition is the incorrect aspect of the sentence. It should be to, not with. Well, when there was an old ghost with centuries' worth of knowledge that no one else could see or hear except for him, one best believed that he'd take advantage of that in a dire situation, and this was definitely qualified as a dire situation. The preposition is wrong, he repeated almost word for word, like the cheat he was. With should be replaced with to. Present Mike beamed as he pointed a set of finger guns in his direction. That's right! On to the next question. Mike-sensei, Midori interrupted before he could move on to the next question, and subsequently the next tangent, ignoring the twist in his gut that came along with. Can I go to the restroom? The English teacher looked caught off guard for a second, before his usual announcer grin shifted into something more mellow and understanding. Of course, just take the hall pass by the door. Sitting in the back corner of the classroom, farthest from the door, certainly had its advantages, but this was not one of them. The boy tended to avoid getting up in the middle of class for this exact reason, putting off bathroom breaks until after, because what could be worse to an introverted teen than having to squeeze awkwardly by his classmates on his way to the door? Still, he slinked between desks like a cat, careful not to bump anyone or something on his way out. He made a quick snatch at the lanyard hanging by the exit before slipping out into the freedom of the empty hallway. Gami trailed beside him, not having to worry about slowing down to navigate the classroom. Together, they turned down the hall, approaching one of the boys' bathrooms on the side. It wasn't a surprise to either of them when they passed it and just continued walking. Midori was thankful UA didn't employ hall monitors like Aldera did, or he'd be much more paranoid about skipping around the school like this. If anyone was to stop and check him, they'd certainly wonder what he was doing, so far from the nearest restroom or his class. Maybe they'd assume he was up to something devious like a high school boy was capable of doing. He turned to a staircase, flew down a floor. He still checked both ends of the hallway before turning into it and making his way down. The bathrooms on his floor were always too crowded. Even during the middle of class, they always seemed to be at least having 2 students inside at all times, and that simply wouldn't work when he needed full privacy to talk to his mentor or at least get something out of his system. So after the first few times he scouted out all the bathrooms on his floor, he went in search of a more peaceful sanctuary somewhere else. Enter this seemingly forgotten restroom next to a janitor's closet. The door opened with a piercing squeak, but that mattered little when inside there was no one. The teen walked hastily over to the sink, resting himself on it fully like he would collapse at any second. He gripped the porcelain like a lifeline, head falling on his neck limply. I feel like a wreck, he heaved. Like I've been hit by a bus. Gami circled around him, examining him briefly. Well, you have no physical ailments that I can see as of now. Midori groaned, half out of discomfort, half out of annoyance. Of course he wouldn't have any injuries. He wasn't hurt. However, the ghost wasn't stupid. Oblivious and lost at times, yes, but not an idiot. He rubbed a gentle hand on his successor's back, hoping to ease the sickness out of him. Are you really that worried about this afternoon's meeting? The boy let out a heavy sigh, shoulder slumping under imaginary weight. I mean, I don't know. Exasperated, he managed to pick his dead weight for a head, just back up slightly, meeting the reflection of his eyes in the mirror. He really did look awful. There were heavy, dark circles under his eyes. His skin was tinted much paler than usual. His lips were arguably blue. It was as if he'd been raised from the dead. How had no one said anything yet? Well, Kirishima and Ida did, but that was really only out of his demeanor. I want to talk to him, but he averted his gaze from the mirror, no longer able to look himself in the eye. It's just been a lot. I feel like I haven't had a chance to really breathe in, the past year. Gami let out a small chuckle, though it was more of an awkwardness than humor. Yes, it has been quite the roller coaster. The duo settled into a strangely uncomfortable silence, one uncommon between them. Midori turned back to the mirror, staring at himself again. He'd come to the bathroom with the intention of making himself throw up in hopes that it would help, but now that he was here, he really didn't feel like having stomach bile burn up his esophagus. He moved his gaze lower, settling on the faucet. Maybe some cold water would help freshen him up. Surprisingly, he was already feeling a little better after leaving the class, though maybe that would be better attributed to the mini-vent with Gami. The faucet opened with a squeak that rivaled the door in loudness, and cool water rushed down the drain. He slipped off his gloves, running a thumb down their classy green stripe, before shoving them back into his pocket. Collecting water in his hands, he rubbed his face, hoping that it would rub the dark circles and paleness right out. Let us simply focus on making it to lunch first, the spirit remembered, and rambled while his successor had continued to splash cold water on his face. We can take this one step at a time. It is much less overwhelming that way. He switched off the water. Dressing his hands back up in their usual fabric barriers, he swiped at his damp face with his uniform sleeve, drying it good enough before meeting his reflection one last time. He looked more alive than before, so the refreshing had done something, and he was feeling a little better than before as well. He could do this, just one step at a time. Yeah, that's right. One step at a time. A piercing squeak rang out and echoed off the bathroom walls. Huh, so now the hero course is talking to themselves. Midoriya spun on his heels, regretting it instantly as the vertigo rushed back into his veins. He clutched the sink in one hand for balance, taking a step back to further steady himself. Standing in the doorway was the same purple-haired student that had presented himself to Class 1A just about a week prior. Same disappointed stance and all. He remained slouched in the doorway just enough that the door almost closed behind him. His eyes held that same cynicism that rattled his core, that same gaze that made him freeze like a deer in the headlights. It was predatory, the way it sparked some animalistic cowardice in him. He was trapped in this bathroom, and yet, even through his obsessive desire to get the hell out of there, Midori couldn't help but notice the slight redness of his pale face, liveliness that otherwise would have looked perfectly normal in a typical complexion. His stance had uncertainty, just as it held that daunt that forced him to back away. His eyes held wavering, just as they held that fierceness that urged him to flee. It was a look that felt oh so familiar. Do you really feel so comfortable in your superiority that you're skipping class over something as pitiful as this? And that's when he remembered he wasn't exactly as alone as he intended to be. Midoriya broke out of his stupor, waving his hand in front of his frazzled expression. What was he even supposed to say, though? That he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't talking to himself, that he was just talking to a 500-year-old ghost that liked to follow him around and had been casually mentoring him for the majority of his life? Yeah, like that secured his spot in the top hero course any better. Still, he better say something rather than nothing at all. Opening his mouth to respond, he took a breath to calm that shakiness in his stomach and... Don't. He froze, reply caught in his throat. Have you forgotten last time? Do not engage with him. The firmness in his voice was undeniable, more than enough to halt him in his tracks. Something most certainly is not right about him. The teen trusted Gami with his life, or at least the aspects of his immortality that were still vulnerable, so he locked his lips shut and snapped his hands to his sides in an instinctual effort to protect himself. The seconds ticked by painfully, nearly as bad as his stomach pains from earlier, and with each passing moment the atmosphere grew more and more tense and more awkward. The two stared at each other like a standoff, as if each had a pistol by their side and ready to draw, but Midoriya couldn't shoot that bullet, not with Gami's hand practically on the trigger. His only other option was to leave, his escape now turning into a prison, but was he to do that silently, leave without uttering a word? In fact, the other boy was still in the doorway. He'd have to push his way through, and after Bakugo had certainly left an impression on the rest of the students, one of rudeness and arrogance, he didn't want to do the same. He didn't want to perpetuate the perception that Bakugo had uncaringly thrust upon their class, upon their kind. Sure, that desire was rooted partially in his righteous nature to resolve the betrayal that rang about in the classroom, but it was also a product of himself. He didn't want to come off as insolent or self-absorbed, because that simply wasn't the kind of person he was. He couldn't discuss it either with Gami, lest he solidify his newfound reputation as a schizophrenic, but the longer he stood in silence, the further it seemed to bind him to morbid pacifism. This tense stare-down was unsustainable, intolerable, excruciating. Even the most formidable of defenses would be unable to stand untouched, so an executive decision was made. With gloved fingers balled into his uniform fabric, Midoriya hastily pushed forward, surprising even his own legs. He only needed a good few steps to make it to the blocked doorway, but by that point he had already committed. I'm just gonna go. The purple-haired teen made a surprisingly quick sidestep to the left, freeing the door and allowing Midoriya to escape. The two made brief eye contact, both sharing an inkling of shock just for a second, and maybe through that familiarity they both found new ground to stand on. Maybe they both grew to a new level of understanding that maybe, despite all the words thrown around, they really weren't as different as they sought out to believe. Then again, is that really reasonable to assume from merely a glance of chance? Gami hesitated for a moment, before following his successor out of the restroom, chasing his stumbling form. He caught up to Midoriya just seconds later, who was gripping his chest like he'd had a heart attack. The boy turned back to the stairwell, and he used the momentary privacy to catch his breath. He held such a death grip. On the lanyard, it would have choked out any living equivalent. I think I feel worse." The ghost hunched down with a sigh, careful not to encroach too drastically on the newfound space. "Regardless, we should head back. We have certainly been out a while." Yeah, that was true. God, his perception of time had been so screwed with, and it really hadn't been the pseudo-zombie's fault, though he had certainly played his part in it. Hopefully it hadn't been too long. So with one mediocre breath, he collected himself enough to finish that flight of stairs, trudging along down the still empty hall towards his class. He dared not disturb the socially contracted silence upheld by the few stragglers that did cross him. He hoped that he wouldn't be disrupting a major part of the lesson when he came back in, or any part of the lesson, really. Despite his intense hate of noise and his current wasted state, he was really banking on the classroom being in chaos by the time he returned. Maybe then his appearance would go relatively unnoticed. Letting out one exhale, he had his hand once again resting on the surface of the classroom door and reached for the edge. It took a bit more effort to pull the sliding door than he had anticipated, however, but he just hoped that was all in his imagination. "Just to restate before we finish for today, prepositions are used to show—" The class paused and zeroed in on the teen like a flock of seagulls, spotting a lone chip on a beach. The already quiet classroom managed to hush down even more, like his mere presence was taboo. Eyes panned in his direction, leaving him squirming under a tense microscope. Even Present Mike halted in his speech, startled by his sudden entrance. God damn it. Midoriya couldn't agree more. There was this indistinguishable look in the English teacher's eyes. Well, maybe it wasn't all that hidden, actually. Maybe it was just the instinctual panic flooding Midoriya's system that masked it. Maybe he was too focused on not taking that passive step backwards or making sure his heart didn't burst from his chest, but he couldn't just tell what Present Mike was feeling, whether it was simple surprise or solemn disappointment or even stirring anger, because, of course, he managed to return right at the end of class. Just how long did he spend in that bathroom? "Midoriya," the voice hero interrupted his thoughts before the silence grew too awkward. "Can we step outside for a moment?" He nodded, because of course he nodded. What else was he going to do? What other option possibly was there in front of not only his entire class, but one of the few heroes, hell, one of the few people that he truly felt at ease with? There was no way in paradise that he was going to deny him, much less say anything else at all. Right now he was mortified, and combined with a distrusting exterior and guarded personality, all he desired was for the earth to just swallow him up, and he'd never be seen again. The two, plus Gami, stepped outside the room, and Midori watched as the teacher shut the door quietly behind him. The blonde guided him a few more steps away, just to ensure that the amount of privacy they wanted would be possible out in the empty yet open hallway. There was a careful effort made not to make physical contact by Present Mike, but his undertaking went largely unnoticed, of which went unnoticed overall. Yamada had to resist the urge to squat down, remembering that he was not dealing with the young, frightened children that he was used to, but rather a more wary teenager who had no desire to be babied. But it took more conscious effort than he was used to, struggling to keep himself from making some form of physical contact with him. "Little listener, I'm not upset with you." He made sure to establish that right off the bat because he could feel the protective shell the boy had around him rolling in waves. "I'm just worried about you." Midoriya shuffled a bit in spot, fighting himself on how to proceed, because he liked Yamada. He liked the man and the aura he radiated, but at the same time he never had been called into a school hallway for anything good. He was already more than embarrassed and wanted nothing more than to just sit down and pretend that the entire incident never happened. But the longer he stood there, in dry silence, the more he realized how comfortable he had grown among the voice hero, because he couldn't even ponder the idea of purposely ignoring him. Even the thought of cooking up a half-baked lie made his slightly quelled stomach start to churn once more. The thoughts nearly made him smile somberly. "I'm sorry, Yamada-sensei. I didn't mean to take so long." In the end, he succumbed to that new tameness that dwelled underneath his shell, but it really didn't feel as traitorous as he expected. "I just haven't been feeling all that great today." Immediately, the teacher's eyes softened, as if they weren't soft enough already. He removed his signature shades, presenting the humanity in his eyes, and along with the heroic borderline parental concern that was visible as well. His voice mellowed out to match his eyes, and the worry became even too much to be human, if that was possible. "Are you worried about the meeting with Kiori?" "No, I mean, well, I guess," he stammered over himself. "It's just—" "You're feeling nervous about how this might go down?" Yamada interrupted, but it held no annoyance. I haven't done nearly as many interrogations as Sho, but from what I've done, I do know that most run-of-the-mill criminals are more bark than they are bite. He knew the hero was only trying to reassure him, but this was going to be far from a typical interrogation, and Kiori Ryoyami was far from a run-of-the-mill criminal. After all, killing Ishihara took more than a bite than it did bark. Yamada was only trying to help, but what did he know? It should be pretty routine, considering Suka approved of you going in to talk with him, the blonde continued. He wouldn't want you to be there. If the situation was more delicate, I don't blame him. I couldn't imagine having to interview a villain I personally know. Midori clenched his teeth. What did he know? The teacher noticed the sudden shift in his demeanor, ending his ramble just as suddenly, and switching to something more reassuring as intended. Are you second-guessing whether or not to do the interview? You don't have to if— No! The teen exclaimed, cutting him off before he could catch himself. He startled even himself with how loud it came out, taking a moment to recoup. No, I want to do this. It wasn't a want anymore. It wasn't even a necessity anymore, not to him at least. It was the principle of his existence, the principle of lives that were exchanged for it. If present Mike was startled by his fervor, he certainly didn't show it. Then you just gotta give it your all. It's normal to be nervous, but you can't let that hold you back. Push past all the doubt and go, yeah. Obviously, his inspirational speech was much more toned down than how it would have normally come out. He was still in a school hallway, after all, but even then, waves of enthusiasm rolled off of him and infected the air, to the point where Midori couldn't help but smile. The hero really had that kind of effect on people, warmth that didn't thin the air but lifted it. He forgot about the painful prospect of today's meeting that had settled in his stomach, and about the vigilante-like motivation behind it. His stomach drifted off to the corners of his temples, and his gut drifted into equilibrium. Or maybe he simply forgot about them for a moment. Maybe he simply forgot about them in the presence of surrogate bliss. Thanks, Yamada-sensei. I think I really needed to hear that. The hero looked caught off guard by that, not expecting such a sincere and heartfelt confession from someone so typically reserved. His wide eyes eased to quiet gratification, and a much softer yet equally bright smile pulled at his lips. It's no problem, little listener. He had to resist the urge to ruffle the fluffy green hair before him. I'm just glad that you're feeling better. It took conscious effort not to lose the smile he had just gained. The uncertainty in his stomach riled up again. Yeah, better. Here. Yamada handed him a wrapped granola bar from his pocket that Midori had clearly remembered from the kitchen counter. Snacking usually helps me relax after a stressful day, so it should help you relax before one. When the packaged bar had remained in his hand for some more time, he gave a confirming nod. Don't worry about me. I had a full breakfast this morning. Besides, I'll just steal whatever Show's got if I'm really hungry. The teacher laughed at himself at the thought, but his words were enough to get the boy to take from his hand. He inspected the packaging briefly, for no particular reason, before stuffing the item in his pocket, making sure the little bit sticking out was covered by the ends of his uniform. But before they could continue any further, the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Immediately, all the adjacent doors began pouring out, flooding the halls with a sea of students, and Midori instinctively edged closer to his classroom door. Well, that's my cue, Yamada sighed, looking out at the chaos before him. If you need anything at all, little listener, just drop by the teacher's lounge at lunch. And then the blonde walked off into the raging sea, leaving Midori all alone in the rising waters. He almost moved to follow him, but his life buoy had him tethered to the classroom door. Thanks again, Yamada-sensei, he whispered out to the sea of everything and no one. Then he reeled himself in before he was swept out. He slipped through without opening the door all too wide, closing it hastily behind him to keep the savage currents out. He almost forgot about the fact that there were people inside with him, and he let out a sigh of relief. Hey, Midori! Everything good with Mike-sensei? Kirishima called out, not at all quietly, as he approached him from the mass of desks. Gami shifted in through the wall at that, settling in his usual spot next to his successor, just as more people seemed to tune in. Yeah, the lie slipped smoothly off his tongue before he even realized that his mouth was open. He was just worried that I needed to see Recovery Girl. That was more than enough to catch the class dad's attention, as well as his other friends toward the back of the room. Kirishima furrowed his brows at the response, seemingly not satisfied or put at ease by its contents. His face morphed into friendly concern, a look that Midori wasn't all that used to seeing. Recovery Girl? He repeated. You sure you're feeling all right? His stomach twisted at the words, and suddenly that granola bar seemed to weigh much heavier in his pocket. In less than 7 hours, he would be face to face with the person who had changed his life forever. The person who seemed to only answer the beck and call of the universe alone. The person who had taken away the light of his best friend. The person who had dared to show his face again after. He'd be face to face with him in less than 7 hours, locked in a room where he couldn't possibly run away from the weight of his actions again. He would have to answer to the call of justice and explanation, and pay to the collector of consequences. Face to face with the person he had ever the desire to end by his own hand. All in less than 7 hours. Midori. His stomach snapped like an elastic band, and his knees nearly gave out. Yeah, I'm good. Don't worry about it. He did end up eating what Yamada had given him, bending to his whims far sooner than he would have liked to admit. He just needed something to soothe his internal twister, and while it certainly held the risk of making him spout it back up during class, he really couldn't afford another bathroom trip in front of everyone. None of his surrounding classmates seemed to mind the slight noise. In fact, Todoroki just sent a couple of periodic glances to check up on him. Despite feeling as awfully as he was, Midori couldn't deny the warmth that had come out of outside concerns. It was almost relieving to realize that someone actually cared, a whole slew of people at that, a sensation so alien, yet he welcomed it frantically. It was nearly enough for him to wish that he'd be sick more often, but he wasn't that desperate. He'd been doing just fine on his own anyway. But that granola bar did little to hold off his overactive stomach acid, and both he and his gut were turning for that lunch dismissal bell. He was afraid that if the crackling of the plastic wrap didn't do it for his peers, then his anxious tapping most certainly would. A statue was far from his grasp, as he was laying hunched over his desk, in agony and impatience. There was a true physical struggle to get through the remaining period separating him from relief, much less actual focus. He employed his hands to drum against the wood for his ears, if only to drown out the sharp noises elsewhere in the room. One leg bounced in anticipation, or maybe just for tranquility, or maybe just to take him away from the infectious thoughts swirling around in his head, or maybe just because he could. And then that bell finally gave in to the whims of the universe, or maybe just his silent, desperate pleas. Not that he was a desperate man. Ectoplasm, who had been going on about something related to factoring, finally stopped talking, and once he noticed some of his peers beginning to rise from their sedimentary rears out of the corner of his eye, his own heart fluttered with expectation. Imagine him being this excited over lunch. It was like his younger years all over again. Took a couple of attempts to get his drowsy limbs to function like he wanted them to, resembling a young fawn in a morning dew. He sent a stink eye to his mentor, who had stood merely to the side and watched him stumble around like a newborn. A little help would have been nice, he hissed out once he was sure that his 2 feet would be able to support his body weight. It would have seemed strange from an outside perspective. You would have resembled a broken puppet. The ghost quipped back just a little too quickly. Midoriya hummed under his breath, a little more ticked off than he usually would have been. Sure. Gami wasn't oblivious. He picked up on the harsh response immediately, shrinking back a bit. He hadn't realized how irked the teen had grown throughout the early day, certainly not expecting the laced reply. The day hadn't been a great start, that was for sure, but still Midoriya seemed extra volatile and irritable today. He hoped it wouldn't continue on into the meeting later. I apologize. He didn't dare lay a hand on him, not while he was in this prickly state. I was only attempting to be humorous. The boy huffed, but seemed to simmer down at that. It was hard to be angry at the spirit when all he ever did was everything for his own well-being, a prospect that was both heartwarming and bittersweet to his conscience, because while he absolutely loved the constant warding from loneliness, a piece of him felt especially guilty at the fact that Gami was essentially tethered to him. What life did the ghost have outside of budding his own? The fact that he couldn't answer left him awfully demoralized, and his strained mood switched immediately to one of dismay. Hey, Midori! Uraraka waved him over, but didn't bother to wait for him as she skipped over to his desk. You ready to go? He noticed the class had cleared out, wondering just how long he'd been spent thinking about his morality, considering his companion. He nodded as convincingly as he could. Coming. He kind of stumbled over to the door, where Ida waited patiently for them, holding the door open so all 3 could chat together down the hall. But the further they proceeded, however, the more his friend seemed to eye his behavior with suspicion. Maybe his walk was too frazzled, or his words too limp, or his face too counterfeit. He wasn't all too sure. He was trying his best, truly, but between his testiness, his guilt, and his obligations, he was torn by all these different heartstrings in ways that were not as wholesome as he would have liked. I know that you've been saying all day that you're fine, but Uraraka finally spoke up for the lot of them. You seem really tense. Are you sure nothing's wrong? Don't get him wrong. There was absolutely no part of him that enjoyed lying to the face of those he considered friends, and even those he didn't necessarily. Some of the essence of guilt began rising among the sickness in his stomach, stirred by the dismissal of those that had held some concern for his well-being. It made him feel wrong. It made him feel cruel, but there was simply no other option, because what would he say? That he was meeting one of the USJ attackers, who he coincidentally had a more personal connection with, that stemmed far beyond his affliction with the school, or one that could be easily judged as a vigilante in nature, one of which had been purposefully kept from everyone around him? Because that would end well. "I'm sorry for worrying you," he began for what felt like the 10th time today. "But If you wish to keep what has been troubling you to yourself, that is all right," Ida interrupted in the most parental way possible, though it didn't come off as snobbish at all. "Just as long as you intend to deal with it in a healthy manner." He turned to the class president with a bit of a wide eye, caught off guard by the relenting response from such an uptight individual. "Oh, I'm so sorry if I was coming off as pushy," Uraraka seconded frantically, a different kind of worry striking her. "Please, don't feel obligated to share if you don't want to. I was just worried, that's all." "As am I," Ida continued, switching over to that respectable role model character they all had grown accustomed to. "However, we must be aware of the existing conditions around us, take into consideration factors and contribution beyond our knowledge, and attribute them to the current situation in order to account for pre-existing behavior." As much as he did appreciate Ida's intervention, he decided one of his own was necessary to save Uraraka any mortification that she might be building in her conscience. "Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you understanding. I promise I'll make sure to deal with it today." That stopped his friends before they, or more effectively Ida, could continue down whatever rabbit hole they were traveling. They turned to him, smiled silent words of reassurance before moving along into some other conversational topic that Midoriya simply wasn't paying attention to. He would deal with it today, whether he was ready or not. Time waited for no man, and he had waited long enough for the time. Nothing, not worry, not fear, nothing, would prevent him from carrying out his desire for closure, if only to service the afterlife. Ishihara would finally know the details of his demise, from the moments leading before to the aftermath, as well as the face that brought it. This would end today. Finally, a path into the cafeteria was cleared, and the trio found their place on one of the lunch lines in the eternal waiting game. He'd been doing that of late. Eternal waiting games, yes, but getting into the lunch line more importantly. Typically, he held the table and waited for the others, but for once he preferred this new change of pace. Sure, they ran the risk of losing their favorite spot, but compared to the comfort of feeling teenage, it was an easy price to pay. He felt like a normal kid, laughing and smiling while piling up his tray. Fried rice, yes please. Beef dumplings, don't mind him. Steamed vegetables, he'd make the room. It was the world he'd been missing his whole life. Maybe the universe had finally grown bored with pulling his leg. Since their signature table was still free by the time they'd all exited the line, it was a nice feeling, sitting down with everyone else and bringing a tray down with him. A euphoric high that hadn't yet crashed. From since earlier this week, he didn't wait for the others, snapping apart his chopsticks and diving in, stomach taking full control of his head. Now that the food was in front of him, he didn't feel all that sick as he was before. Maybe it was the savory aroma that wafted into his nose, or maybe he was simply riding off the contact high courtesy of his friends. They really knew how to take his mind off the more stressful things, after all. "Was it just me?" Uraraka began, her cheeks full, stuffed with dumplings on each side. "Or did Lunch Rush seem, a bit stressed, more than usual? He came off a little frazzled." In all honesty, Midori really wasn't paying attention at all. Much too preoccupied with stuffing his own face and satisfying his stomach. He looked up, though, trying to catch the conversation, while holding onto the piece of broccoli between his lips. A drop of sauce dribbled down his chin, and Gami had to resist the urge to both laugh and throw a napkin at him. "Well, though he is our school chef, Lunch Rush is still an active hero," Ida theorized, setting his utensils down. "Plenty of heroes now have their hands full trying to apprehend the villains targeting fellow heroes." Midoriya froze, dropping the dumpling from his chopsticks, with the wood utensils themselves clattering onto the plastic tray. His friend shot him a confused look, but a quick and awkward smile was all that was necessary to set them back on track. Simple mistake, that's all it was. He picked those chopsticks back up with a now shaky hand. "Oh yeah, that's right," the brunette confirmed, the memory dawning on her. "That's been popping up all over the news lately. Heroes being attacked by that new villain, the hero killer, right?" The teen pressed a glob of rice in his mouth, forcing himself to swallow it and push down the bile coming up his throat. Attacked? That was certainly putting it lightly. The media was calling him the hero killer for a reason. Though to be fair, there was quite a few details being held from media courtesy of the police. If everyone knew the details he was seeing in his premonitions, well, there'd be a lot more panic from the public, even if they weren't the prime target. Indeed, though he refers to himself by Stain, Ida clarified. So far, he is responsible for the death of 10 heroes, and the injuries of countless others. It's no wonder that Lunch Rush and others find themselves swamped with stress. The pressure on catching this madman is astronomical. 10? I only thought it was 8, Uraraka gasped. Ida shook his head. Media's numbers aren't, well, accurate, but that's for the sake of maintaining a relative standard of calmness. My brother gets more precise updates as Ingenium. Midoriya clenched his hands underneath the table, unsure if the feeling he was having was going to be to choke or to puke, but slight shivers ran up and down his spine to the point where he was afraid they were getting to be visible to the naked eye. The media had purposely been underinformed of only 8 deaths. Most heroes only knew of 10. Why did he have to be the only unlucky one to know of the full 13 at the hands of the hero killer? Or one of the few. Blood splattered at his irises. As he flinched unconsciously only for it to disappear upon opening his eyes, he could still hear the metallic clang of knives grinding against each other and human flesh. The stench clung to his clothes like a midnight sweat, the smell of blood mixed with desperate tears pleading for mercy. Sure, they may not have been perfect heroes, but they were people nonetheless, people with lives and goals, dreams and hearts, all taken from them without warning, brutally without care, indifferently like chickens lined up for slaughter. Midori! Yeah? He sputtered, snapping back to attention. Both Ida and Uraraka were staring at him with these concerned looks in their eyes, and quite frankly it startled him. The air was so tense that he nearly reached out to his throat in an attempt to force himself to breathe, though it wouldn't have done much with his clammy hands. She sent a glance off to the side, to her rule-abiding counterpart, before refocusing on him. Are you really sure you're okay? Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine, Midoriya stammered out without skipping a beat. Just, chills. Yeah, chills. He finished with a shaky smile, hoping, praying that it was enough to pass. His heart still raced disturbingly fast, so fast that he worried it was audible in the air around him. The sickness in his stomach returned despite having eaten more than half his lunch. Just breathe. Right, that. Yeah. Ida frowned. Maybe you should see recover. Hey, it's you! Midoriya, right? The trio snapped to the side, only to flinch back as a pink-haired female practically threw herself onto the table. Her thick, rosy locks flung forward and bounced on her shoulders, a support course uniform very messily and thrown over a greasy tank top. Her face contorted into a wide, blinding smile as she gripped the edge of the table with her work gloves. All Midoriya could see, however, was a villainous grin from ear to ear, face covered in splatters of blood, eyes shadowed out by stained bandages. Evil radiated off of him in waves. Please go away. He didn't want to see him again. Hey, Hatsume-san, he stumbled. Just call me Midori. Everyone does. She grinned even brighter, which only made the boy shrink further back into skin. Uraraka's curiosity got the better of her, however, and she sent the other female a pleasant grin. Are you a friend of Midori's? The name's Uraraka Ochako. It's nice to meet you. Her hand was then promptly shook by Hatsume with so much vigor, her wrist nearly detached. I'm Hatsume May, inventor and support course student at your service. Ida Tenya, a pleasure to meet you. He straightened his glasses while offering a handshake. I must ask, how are you affiliated with Midoriya? The inventor smiled even wider, making everyone wonder if her cheeks were elastic. He's wearing one of my babies right now, which reminds me I came to check on them. How are they working for you? Pleased with my success? Midoriya watched his friend sputter for a change, snapping him looks of shock. Their heads turned so fast they practically came off their necks, turning so far it was unnatural. Snapped necks, faces pressed against the pavement of an abandoned alleyway. The bodies were long dead from the stab wounds anyway, just like he liked to snap their necks for the fun of it, maybe as a final extra punishment. The life drained from their eyes as the monster above them mocked with their fleeting strength, taunting them in their final moments. His smile, that disturbing, gruesome grin, shone in the darkness of the alley with satirical sourness. That disgustingly long tongue licked the stray blood from his lips and... Gloves! She's talking about the gloves. He wrenched his hands out from under the table to show them off where he had hid them, and they were tangled in one another tightly. They're working great, Hatsume-san. I'm more than impressed. He wasn't exaggerating. The gloves really were better than he could have ever hoped for, if the still intact table had anything to say. His friend seemed to get the idea, relaxing and then further developing into conversation with her. He really didn't pick up on what they were saying, was too focused on the way his heartbeat was racing and his churning stomach. The food in front of him didn't even smell good anymore. Didn't even smell like food. All he could smell was the phantom rust of drying blood and the meat of dying flesh. The chatter in front of him had faded away until it was practically non-existent, replaced in his head with screams of agony, frantic begging, dying out into dim moans just as their life did. Then there was that signature low mumble of the hero killer, chastising their flaws in their final hours. He didn't know which extreme was worse, his manic insane taunting at the cusp of his high or the dull lifeless lecturing as he stole second chances without second thought. Sometimes he left with a psychotic smile, other times it was nothing but stoicism, but always it was without sympathy, without a care in the world that he had snatched a life with nothing but his bare hands and a set of blades. Though when he licked the red off his sword like he was lapping up water, it horrified him to no end. Even if his face was clean after the murder, he'd painted it eventually upon consuming the deceased's blood from the hero in the end and slurping it to his mouth like some demented shade of lipstick, staining his teeth like coffee. That grin, tainted red with the spoil of death, that grin smiling heartlessly in the thought of his next drink. Midoriya stood up all of a sudden, completely unconsciously, to the complete and utter surprise of everyone, including himself. He nearly tipped over his tray, grains of sticky rice falling from a rocking bowl. He scrambled to catch his breath, but it had long been stolen, fleeting images of a murderer dangling in front of him, watching the life drain from his eyes as he had done with all of his other victims. He clutched at his chest, breathing. Was he breathing? Midori? How many times had he heard that? 4? 5? How many excuses later was he? Bathroom! The boy waited for no response, tumbling out of his seat, away from the group. Away, away, away. He needed to get away. The air was too thick, his throat was closing, he was gasping for breath that simply wasn't there. His feet stumbled on their own. He wasn't even sure where he was going, just acknowledging the instinctual desire to run away from the crowd, away from prying dull eyes, away from the stench of the dead, away from him. Suddenly he was jerked back by his waist, the change so instantaneous he nearly fell backwards on the floor. If it weren't for the undead body that stopped him. Sure enough, he looked down after his head had stopped spinning to see Gami's hands wrapped around him, keeping him from running any more. He struggled unintentionally, that desperate desire to flee outweighing any source of reason that he could have collected. Thankfully, at least in hindsight, the ghost's grip was strong. He fought and fought and fought until the fight in him tired and his arms dropped to his sides. Gami delicately held his body as it gave out, stroking his hair softly. "It is all right. It's all right. You can relax." Midoriya wanted to cry, but he didn't want to break down in the middle of a hallway. That sickness from earlier came back full force, slamming into him like a truck as he completely collapsed into his mentor's arms. He trembled, unsure if he needed to throw up or sob. Between his trouble sleeping, his meeting later with Kiori, and the duty he had to finally bring peace to Ishihara, this unreasonable obligation he held towards the capture of the hero killer, it was all just so overwhelming. "I need you to stand straight, unless you wish to explain your unnatural posture to the first witness who happens to come by." I know, the teen slurred. He made a slow effort to pick himself back up, but ultimately he was unsuccessful. There was a pause. Neither of them moved, nor said a word, but Midoriya knew that Gami had seen him fail. There was no real way to play that off. He just really didn't want to seem any weaker than he already had. He didn't want to ask. Please, don't make him ask. When the spirit watched him fumble around like a newborn fawn, this time he held no hesitation in hoisting him up to his feet. He didn't remove his skeletal hands right away, however, worried his successor might lose his balance if left unattended. And he did, multiple times, stumbled around like a drunk, which was a dastardly comparison, and each time his feet tripped over themselves, or nothing at all, he cursed himself a little more. He was such a mess. How could someone like him be responsible for human life when he was so pathetic at managing his own? Here he was, a gift like no other, a look into the future so it could be changed, so he could change it, and yet here he was trembling over the mere thought of the hero killer who had practically beaten him into submission, foresight, gift or not. Hero killer 13. Himself 0. God, could his fucked up powers be used for anything good? Midoriya leaned against a wall, untrusting of his legs to support him anymore, his hands balled at his sides in frustration, his head down, unable to bring himself to look up anymore. He was angry angry and disappointed at himself and the abilities he was beginning to feel pride in. He wanted to be better. He needed to be better, but his confidence began to fall apart once more because how could his deadly powers be used for good if he kept failing at that? His mentor floated over to his side, hesitant on making eye contact, while the words remained hesitant on his tongue. What to say, what to say, what to say? What to say when his words mattered so drastically, when any little mistake could send them spiraling back from the forward steps they'd been making? Midori, what you doing out there? The duo stumbled, snapping out of their trance. Midoriya's feet slipped out from under him, the wall being the only thing keeping him from meeting the floor. His hands clutched at the wall behind him, very ungracefully, but it got the job done. He lifted his head up so fast, his hair defied gravity, floating in the air for a few moments before gently resting back on his forehead. Dark Shadow? The bird giggled at his obvious confusion. That's me. That really didn't do much to wipe the clear bewilderment off the boy's face. With furrowed brows, he looked in either direction, noticing to his right the long body of Dark Shadow stretching around the corner, one specific person absent from the area. Where's Tokiyami? Dark Shadow laughed again, clearly taking pride in his mischief. He swirled around Midoriya, observing his scrunched-up face in humor. Gami slipped away, neither paying any mind. He slithered down the hall, following the trail of Dark Shadow's body, as he stopped around the corner, almost wary of what he might encounter, but that was impossible. After all, Gami was afraid of nothing. So he dipped into the hallway, taking the plunge like diving into ice water. Now that the ghost was, well, a ghost, so maybe ice water wasn't the best comparison, but regardless, he jumped back as if his living body reacted to sudden shock, shooting back to his successor's side. Dark Shadow, Tokiyami hissed quietly. You know you're not supposed to be seen outside of heroic. The scold died on his tongue as he fully rounded the corner and took note of the scene in front of him. His frustration turned to immediate disappointment as he watched his partner guiltily turn to face him, while his eyes glimmered with a mixture of pride and disobedience. Tokiyami readjusted himself, walking a bit closer to the group as his quirk slowly returned to his side. Ah, Midori, I do thank you for occupying Dark Shadow's attention long enough for me to catch up to him. He thinks because I allow him to appear in the privacy of the restroom that gives him permission to run off in the halls. The Shadow squawked at his partner, bothered that he was being talked about in his current vicinity. Midori chuckled awkwardly, eyeing his mentor briefly before returning his gaze to his classmate. The look didn't go unnoticed by the ever-observant spirit, who also pouted at the implication being made. Tokiyami would never know, but the two of them were more alike than he could ever imagine. Glad I could help, I guess. He pushed forward a smile, one of those nice yet strained ones found in family photos. He couldn't just push it to his eyes, however, and Tokiyami was definitely one of the more observant peers. I know we haven't spoken much of late, he began, but you seem a bit distressed. How many times had he heard that? 4, 5? How many excuses later was he? He nearly let out a sigh, unconsciously. Why was today just so tiring? He opened his mouth with yet another excuse on his tongue, but it got caught in his throat. Maybe his stomach just couldn't take dishing out another one. Maybe his esophagus got sick of swallowing something so dry. Maybe his taste buds finally croaked from the sourness. Either way, he coughed instead, and he practically watched the excuse shoot from his lips and smack limply onto the floor by his feet like a dead fish. He raised a hand to his mouth, embarrassed. Sorry. That smile from earlier began to crumble as his shoulders fell. He caught the glance that Gami sent him from the side, but he was barely able to see it as he scrambled to catch everything falling apart before him. His soul ached painfully, harsh throbs that broke from his chest, and yet, at the same time, he felt this overwhelming desire to clutch at his chest to see if it was really still there. Everything just hurt so much more today. Why? What he wouldn't give for just a dull hum in his ribcage. What he wouldn't give for just a dull hum in his head. If the hero killer could see him now, he'd bet he'd be laughing at the pathetic little boy in front of him. Heck, he'd probably be laughing if he figured out himself at the reason the police had been nipping at his tail. Some wannabe hero he was. Why is someone like you trying to become a hero? How could he have ever thought that powers like this could be used for anything useful? You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. He was just some little boy playing pretend. Come on, I want to hear that little heroic facade of yours break. Dark Shadow exchanged a look with Tokiyami, one unnatural upon the usual carefree bird expression. Midori? 5, right? He was pretty sure that was 5. Maybe. Tokiyami, have Have you thought about your hero name at all? His classmate looked caught off guard for just a second before he shifted into an immense state of thought. My hero name? I can't say I have, he replied, a hand on his chin. Why, is that what's troubling you? Midoriya shrugged half-heartedly. I was just thinking, I'm not really sure what kind of name would fit a quirk like mine. Tokiyami picked up on the train of thought that the other teen had drifted off to. Ah, yes. Beings of the dark like us do have much more to consider when following such bright paths of heroism. Immediately, the boy worried the other had taken his statement the wrong way. I didn't mean any offense, I swear. Nonsense, it's simply a fact we must revel in, Tokiyami affirmed with a calm sense of pride. Darkness is simply a part of who we are, of our existence. Dark Shadow smiled with a vigorous nod, flashing a double thumbs up. However, while it is true that the darkness makes up a part of our souls, it is not nearly the totality of our identities. Midoriya shot a look to his mentor. Hoping that he was following the boy's eccentric speech better than he was, Gami gave him an unapologetic shrug in return. The teen nearly face-palmed. Aspirations are natural to every individual, especially those seeking to diverge from their origins, he continued. Desires to ascend are just as equal a piece of the soul as the soul itself. The green-haired teen smiled nervously, scratching at the back of his head. I'm not sure I follow. Tokiyami sighed, though it was free of annoyance or any sort of malice. Each and every being is composed of who they are and who they wish to be, the present and the future. My desire would be for my hero name to reflect that. He smiled afterwards, and Dark Shadow smiled beside him. They became this bright beam of hope that coexisted when their darker edges were a perfect mesh of yin and yang. Midoriya glanced at Gami in disbelief, wondering if the ghost could see any clearer than him. It was inspiring, seeing the pride Tokiyami took in himself and in Dark Shadow. This was who he was, and he embraced it full force. He wasn't ashamed or displeased or disappointed in his abilities, but rather proud of them and proud of who he was. Any better? The boy snapped out of his thoughts, nodding his head furiously. Yeah, I think I understand now. Tokiyami closed his eyes gently. On that note, then, I shall take my leave. If there's anything else I may assist you with, you know where to find me. Midoriya, in fact, did not really know where to find his classmate, but figured he'd make do if needed, and that or send Gami off to find him. Bye, Midori. Let's meet up again later, Dark Shadow called out as he retreated back into his partner's chest. Faint grumbling from a certain bird boy could be heard just as he disappeared around the corner. Gami snorted in response. Midoriya continued to wave, even after the duo had disappeared from sight, just until his arm grew tired and eventually dropped it to his side. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was even holding. Who was he? Who he wanted to be? Was anything as sedimentary as he originally believed? Izu? Was his definition of his current self accurate? Was the aspect of his desires reasonable? You cannot stand here much longer. Lunch is about to end. What did he really want to change? Izuku! Midoriya shot his head to the side, staring at the empty void of Gami's hoods. Even still, he caught the worry in his demeanor, so he smiled for what was probably the 1000th time that day. This time, however, his eyes smiled too. Yeah, you're right. Uraraka and Ida are probably worried by now. Regardless of what he thought or how he felt, this was who he was, a boy with the weight of the world on his shoulders. His powers were different. Definitely intimidating at first. He saw constant visions of death, and the universe asked him constantly what he'd do about it. And he was stuck like this for the next 100 years, or at the very least. That was just who he was. Now it was finally time to do some good with it. Alright everyone, this concludes Chapter 29 of Deku and Death. Chapter 30 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.